Hi, I'm Creston. Welcome to the third part of our tutorial where we show you how to deploy your Ruby on Rails application to your own server. So we have a few assumptions. First, we're doing a single server deployment on Ubuntu 14.04 server. The application stack we're going to be using is Ruby on Rails version 4, nginx, Unicorn for the Ruby application server, and Postgres SQL. In addition, we're going to be using Capistrano 3 for deployment. In this part, we're going to cover 6 steps. First, we want to update our test app application to make it just a bit more interesting and so that we can test certain features when we deploy to production. We want to be sure to set the Ruby version in the application itself. We want to install the Unicorn and Capistrano Ruby gems, as well as configure Capistrano to be able to deploy to our server. We want to configure Unicorn in our application. And lastly, we want to deploy. Okay, first we want to make some updates to our application. So as a first step, go ahead and change into your application directory /test app, and go ahead and run bin rails server to start up your server. In another terminal window, I'm now going to use the scaffolding of Rails to create a simple model. So I'm doing bin rails, G for generate, a scaffold, and it's going to be called server, and specifying a name and an IP address as to data points I want to track, because everybody wants to track more servers. So I'll go ahead and execute that, and it's going to go ahead and create all the files necessary for that scaffold. Now I want to run a bin rake db migrate to migrate the database. Next, I want to add a route. So I'm going to go to the routes.rb file under the config directory of my application, and I'm going to paste in the following command. So I'm going to establish the root of my application. I want to go to the server's controller and go to the index action. Now I want to be able to do some CSS styling and add an image. So I'm going to go to the servers.css.scss file, and I'm just going to make the h1 tags blue. Now I want to add the image to the index. So if I go to the index file for listing servers, at the very top, I'm going to paste this image tag, which is going to have the Ruby tree logo. Now I also need to grab that image and copy it into the appropriate location. So apps, test app, app assets, and images. Now if I bring up our application, it should now look like this. So I've inserted this image to the top, and now this is blue. And we have a server scaffolding set here at the root, so I can actually go in and create something. And it's created a server listing for us. So I wanted to do the image and the CSS because when you deploy to production, you're going to be using the asset pipeline, and I want to confirm that it's working. All right, let's go ahead and commit these changes. So we'll do a git add, and then a git commit with the message added server scaffold. And then do a git push. The next step is to set the Ruby version. So we want to set the version in the application itself. So when we deploy to the server, this particular application will have its own version that's independent of the global version that may be on the server. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and just use the Nano editor and create a file called .ruby-version. And I'm going to put the version that I want my application to run under in here. And then save and exit. Now I also want to add this to my gem file to ensure that I'm using a particular version of Ruby for these gems. Now, while we're in the gem file, I'm also going to install the 2 gems that we need to. So you just have to uncomment them. So we're going to want to use Unicorn, so we'll uncomment that, and we're going to use Capistrano, or the Capistrano Rails gem, which installs Capistrano as a dependency. Once that's done, we want to run bundle install to install those gems. Okay, they've been installed, and now I actually want to create bin stubs for Capistrano. This creates executables in the bin directory that you can use. So now if I do ls bin, I can see I can run bin/rails, which I've been doing, or rake, and now I can do cap and capify. The next step is to configure Capistrano. So to do that, I want to do bin/cap install, and this sets up a directory and file structure within your Rails application to be able to do a deployment. Now we need to edit some of these files. The first file we're going to edit is the cap file, which is in the root of your application. So below the require Capistrano deploy line, I'm going to include a require Capistrano Rails. So Capistrano Rails includes support for the asset pipeline to run when you're doing a deployment, as well as run your database migrations. Now let's move on to the deploy file. So the deploy.rb file is located in the config directory. So I'm going to remove these 2 statements here and include this block of configuration. So I'm setting the application to test app, the name. I'm setting the repo URL to be where I'm storing it on GitHub. This is my application. Where I'm wanting to deploy my application to on the server, so this is the server directory. I want to deploy using the deploy user, and I'm including these linked directories. So these will persist on the server across deployments. Now, one thing I'm not doing is enabling sudo, because I do my deployments where the deploy user has all the permissions necessary to deploy without requiring sudo permissions. So now I want to move down to this lower part here and make some changes. I want to remove this restart section and include one that allows starting, stopping, and restarting our Unicorn application. And to do that, it's using the initd script we set up on the server earlier. Finally, the last file we want to modify is the production.rb file that's located in config deploy production.rb. This tells you, or tells Capistrano what server you want to deploy your application to. So you need the user and the IP address or domain name. So I'm going to paste the IP address that we're using. And there are 3 different roles: an application role, a web role, and a DB role. Basically, the migrations are run under the DB role. You'll have the web role and then also the application role. Generally, you want to include all of these. The web role runs the asset migrations. And I do want to comment out this one because it's not being used. And that's it for the Capistrano configuration. Okay, now let's configure Unicorn. To do that, I'm going to go back to our editor, and I'm going to create a new file in the config directory. And I'm going to call it unicorn.rb. Now I'm going to paste the configuration needed. Now this is the minimal configuration to get Unicorn working, and I'll explain it here. So I'm specifying a root. This is the root of the application. Capistrano considers this the current release for this application. We're specifying the working directory to be the same as the root, specifying the PID directory, the standard error and standard output paths for logging. We're listening on this Unix socket that we set up, and this is the same one that nginx uses to proxy pass to Unicorn. We're specifying one worker process right now. You can increase this, of course, and specifying the timeout for 30 seconds. There is one more change we need to do before we can push our changes to source control, and that's with the database YAML file. So this defines how Rails talks to your database. Down here in the production section, so this is what's going to be used on our server. Now, I am not going to be using the username and password. If these aren't specified, it's going to try to connect to the database using the deploy user, which is what I want. But it's interesting that this is named test app, because if you recall earlier, I mentioned that if you have more than one application on a server, you want it to run under its own user. And they're doing that exactly here. I use the deploy user because there are some other, it makes it easier for some of the configuration to do. But I could have very easily named the user that I'm installing the application under test app as well. So for right now, I'm going to comment this out and save it. So now it will use the deploy user to connect to the database. And no password will be required because we're working on a single server installation. All right, let's go ahead and add the changes and commit them and push them up. Now we need to do a couple of things on the server before we are ready to do a deployment. Before we go ahead and connect to the server, go ahead and run a bin/rake secret. And this will output a good secret for to include in your application. So how the secret is going to be used is in your Rails application, under the config directory is a secrets.yaml file. And it specifies a secret in the source code for development and test environments, but not for production. It wants you to use an environmental variable. So we're going to set this secret as an environmental variable on the server. So I'm going ahead and SSH into the server, and then I'm going to add that secret to the bashrc file for the deploy user. So I'm going to sudo dano, use an editor to edit the bashrc file. And I'm going to insert right below the following command. So it's going to export secret key base and that secret key that we produced. And the last thing we want to do is go ahead and restart nginx. All right, and we'll go ahead and exit from the server. Now we're ready to deploy our application to the server. So to do that, we need to do a few things to make sure that Capistrano can connect to the server and that the directory structure is set up the way it expects. So I'm going to do a bin/cap production git check to make sure it can connect to Git from the server. And if everything looks good, you shouldn't see any error messages. So that looks good. The next check we want to do is a deploy check. So again, this checks for directories on the server and make sure it can connect. And it looks like everything's good with that. So now is the moment of truth. So do the bin/cat production deploy, and it should deploy our application and start our Unicorn application. Okay, it looks like it finished successfully. Now if we go check that web address, we should see our application. So if I hit refresh with this IP address, I see the image is being delivered and our CSS styling, and we have our scaffold for servers that we set up. So if I hit new server, I should be able to create a server. And there it is. And this even works with the testapp.rubytreesoftware.com that I set up. And it's pointing to the same place. So we've successfully deployed this test application to a production server on Ubuntu. So what we've shown at this point is how to manually configure a server and to do a Ruby on Rails deployment. What I do today for my servers is I use Ansible, which is a configuration management tool to do the entire setup. We're also producing a course on Ansible. If you're interested, please check out rubytreesoftware.com, and we're going to have a courses section where you can look up information about that particular course and also look at tutorials and get all of the code that we use to do this deployment. Thank you so much. I hope you got a lot out of this.